welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and I'm really excited to have Meg Shaffer here, who wrote The Lost Story, which is a book that it defies a lot of conventions in the best way. So you're welcome. I think that's what you were going for. So Meg,
Definitely.
why don't you introduce yourself and introduce The Lost Story, which is your second book at the moment, correct?
Yes, my second book as Meg Shaffer.
Yes.
I used to write romance novels under a different pen name, but yes, this is my second Meg Shaffer book. And Meg Shaffer books are different from my old books. These are sort of fairy tales for grown-ups. So my first book, The Wishing Game, was sort of Willy Wonka for grown-ups, but instead of chocolate, it was children's books. And so The Lost Story is Narnia for grown-ups, or Narnia 15 years later. I'm sure a lot of us read portal fantasy books when we were kids and loved them. Alice in Wonderland is a portal fantasy. Narnia is a portal fantasy. Anywhere where you pass through a door of some sort and end up in another world is a portal fantasy. And I loved those books as kids. I was always checking wardrobes to see if I could sneak through the back of one into another world. And I thought about, with The Lost Story, I wanted to write a book about those kids who did go into a portal world as children and now they're adults, and what their life is like and what happens when they go back and see the world again with adult eyes, and new grown-up problems. So that's the gist of The Lost Story.
So it had a lot of really cool elements that I kind of want to get into, because it wasn't just Narnia. There's definitely notes of Peter Pan in there as well, because it starts with the story of two lost boys.
Yes,
Jeremy
my Lost Boys.
Yes, Jeremy and Ralph, or Rafe as we later know him. And their disappearance begins, but then kind of circles back on Emilie's story, who's looking for her sister who disappeared. And one of the interesting things is that, you find out, obviously, the boys did come back, and it's sort of unclear what happened. But Emilie wants to seek out Jeremy because she thinks that he can help her find her sister. And he thinks that too, but it's kind of complicated. And that's kind of sort of where we begin.
Yes.
And yeah, so which story really came first for you when you were putting this together? Was it Jeremy and Rafe's, or was it Emilie and her sister?
It was definitely Jeremy and Rafe. And for a long time, Emilie was a very minor character. She wasn't even the same character. There was an Emilie in the first draft who was Rafe's fiance, and obviously not the same person. I just kept the
Totally
name because I
not.
liked it for some reason. It meant something in the first book or the first draft, and by the end it means something else. Why I kept the name. For starters, I just liked it. And then kind of a portal fantasy is The Wizard of Oz. So I wanted some names that had magical connotations, and so we have Auntie M from Wizard of Oz, so I kept Emilie's name there just as a little subtle nod to the Wizard of Oz. No, Jeremy and Rafe's relationship came first. It was the primary, their story, because what had happened was I'd read The Lord of the Flies in college and in high school first, and it was fine. I was a little too young to appreciate it. I read it again in college when I was old enough to appreciate it, and it scared the crap out of me. It is a genuinely terrifying book when you read it when you're a little bit older and you pay attention to what's going on. So I wanted to read it again 20 years later, and they just re-released it in this like beautiful graphic cover. So I read it, and after I read it, I think I was like 38 when I read it. not that long ago, it hit me so hard that I wanted desperately to know what happened to Jack and Ralph 20 years later after Lord of the Flies. I couldn't get it out of my head that they would be friends, that they would have to be, because they were the only ones who really understood what happened. So even though they became enemies on the island, that back when they're back in England, they would form some sort of truce, or they would meet once a year and hash things out, or they would hold grudges against each other or have feelings for each other in some way. But I can't write that book because Lord of the Flies is not in the public domain, and I really don't write stuff that is that dark. So I gave up on the idea. But it was about a 1 week obsession trying to figure out how I could do a sequel to Lord of the Flies. So then I gave up and I put the book on the shelf. And I just so happened to put it on the shelf next to my Chronicles of Narnia set. And I looked at it and I looked at Lord of the Flies back and forth. And I went, that's it. I got it. I know what happened. They didn't have this dark, horrible experience when they were 13, like Jack and Ralph in Lord of the Flies. They had a beautiful experience where they went through a portal world, but now they're adults. They're in their 30s and they have all this history with each other. So that's where the book came from. So, but when you have characters who choose something as an adult, choose to do something dramatic, like go to a fantasy world, the question is, why now? Why not before? Why is it happening now? Why didn't they do it last year or 10 years ago? Because I would want to go back. So what kept them from going back? And that's where Emilie's story comes in, and her sister, her missing sister. And all those elements eventually came together after many, many drafts to explain why they hadn't gone back before. So yes, Jack became Jeremy, and Ralph became Rafe, as a little bit of a tribute to Lord of the Flies. But the names are about it from Lord of the Flies that made it into the book. But little homage to that, since it sort of set the gears turning in my head to create the Lost Story.
It's funny because I mean, so the name, just a little aside, we did have a Ralph who used to work at the library, and we did jokingly call him Rafe.
Oh, nice. Because that's the very posh British pronunciation of Ralph. Now, there are some Brits who will say Ralph as Ralph, but Rafe Fiennes, the actor, it's spelled as Ralph but pronounced Rafe. And it just seemed like something like a smart ass kid like Jeremy meets a guy named Ralph and would immediately pronounce it Rafe, especially with Rafe's background being this very salt of the earth country kid in West Virginia. The joke of calling him this posh version of his name was a lot of fun, but I think Jeremy really saw something in Rafe that Rafe did not see in himself, this sort of nobility and this inner beauty and excellence that elevating his name a little bit brought out in him.
So, I mean, one thing that, I think is just interesting is that obviously we're always told as adults we're supposed to put away fairy tales. I think, and I hope that a lot of us are past that. I mean, fantasy and sci-fi is sort of booming now in
Yes.
the genre. We are really, in an era where people go to Comic-Cons to be seen in costume, which to me is wild, because that was stuff that you like pretended you didn't do when I was a teenager, and now people are really into it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all kind of want to be transported into something else. We want the TARDIS to find us. We want to go
Absolutely.
into our wardrobe and find Narnia or something. But I think one thing that you do. This is a very hopeful story, but you do deal with trauma. And when you think about just original fairy tales and how dark they did get, did you think about that a little bit? How fairy tales sort of do help us process trauma. I mean, even Narnia, the Pevensies, they were where they were because of World War II and because of what was happening. And they didn't know whether their father would be coming back or what was going to be happening to England even. So yeah, I was curious about that.
Yes, the storyteller character in the book references the hero with a thousand faces, Joseph Campbell's monomyth, very early on in the book. And one of the aspects of the hero's journey, the monomyth, is the hero's journey into the underworld. So they kind of have to go into hell, into Hades or purgatory or something like that, to face their own death, their own mortality. So I knew if I really wanted to do this sort of hero's journey for these characters, that we would have to go pretty dark. And since it was a fantasy, I could literally go into sort of a dark purgatory, take them there, which was a lot of fun to write. Yeah, it was definitely on purpose. That is kind of the heart of the fairy tale or mythology. Nearly all the great mythologies have the dark forest or some kind of representative of death, or the underworld. Even Jonah being swallowed by the whale, the belly of the whale is kind of an underworld or facing death experience. So everything from Bible stories to Grimm's fairy tales have that aspect, and I wanted to have it too. I wanted it to feel like a real fairy tale in every aspect, but with this modern twist and with grown-up characters, not with 8-year-olds. Because I think even adults have to make that journey. I think we're always choosing that journey, and especially as we get older, the more we have to face the death of our parents, and then eventually our own death. I just graduated from my MFA program on May 3rd, and it hit me that when I graduated from college, all 4 of my grandparents were alive, and when I graduated with my master's, all 4 of them were gone. Just in that 20-year period, so much has changed in my life, and I've lost so many people. So just getting older is a story of loss. It's a lost story. And I didn't want to shy away from that. I know a lot of readers will be my age or a little bit younger, a little bit older, and we'll have to, like Rafe, think about his dead father. One of his parents is dead, and his very complicated relationship with him, and whether, mourning someone that he had a bad relationship with. It's much harder to grieve somebody that you feel like you have unfinished business with than someone you feel like you were at peace with when they're gone. I didn't, so that was something I wanted to write about too, but in a fun fairy tale way, which it is. It's not so heavy and dark.
Not. No,
it's very adventure.
It's not. It is a very beautiful, light story, and it does. But it does, it does hint or sort of talk about some things that are more traumatic. But it really is, again, a fairy tale, involving adults. It is a nice, just beautiful story about people finding magic,
yes,
and each other. So
yeah.
and then
the real magic is each other.
Yes, exactly.
The real magic kingdom is each other, which is anybody who finds a place as an adult, finds their place, their spouse, or their job, their vocation. When that comes together, you're like, oh, this is the magic. I don't, Narnia is nice, but I have my house with my husband and my kitties and my work, and it's all beautiful. And that's my magic kingdom. Yes, I would still go to Narnia, but I wouldn't give up my husband and my kitties and my work, my beautiful life that I have as a writer, leave it all behind just to go to, Neverland. Maybe a day trip, but I'd come back for it.
I mean, but isn't that what the doctor always promises you? I have a time machine. I'll get you back 30 seconds before you left.
Yes. He gets us.
Exactly. But I did want, before we go, I wanted to ask you about the voice of the storyteller and what the storyteller's role is in the book, because there is this kind of omnipotent character, the storyteller, who is giving us a different perspective, and breaks the fourth wall in a very unique way and has a very different voice. You did mention that you have a few different versions of the story that you kind of edited. Was the storyteller always a character?
No, and the storyteller didn't exist until I've been working on this book since 2018. So probably not until 2023 did the did the storyteller exist. But in early drafts, the voice of the narrator was very strong. So there was always this impulse to break the fourth wall as a narrator. And then finally, I just made the narrator a character. Yeah, I just tried it, and it was actually my editor's assistant, her very young assistant, who is working her way up through the ranks of publishing, who said, I like this storyteller character. It would be really cool if they were actually a character in the book and not just a storyteller. Because I had initially conceived it as, you just imagine yourself sitting around the fire at summer camp, and everybody's telling ghost stories or talking about their life. Everybody's telling a story, and to give people that campfire feeling of that old Nickelodeon show, Are You Afraid of the Dark, where the kids meet at the fireplace or at the campfire and tell stories. So the storyteller is such an important part of stories. We forget them. They usually disappear into the story. But since this was a fairy tale and there's an oral tradition in fairy tales, I wanted a storyteller character. But then once my editor's assistant planted that seed in my brain, I could not get rid of it. And I thought, well, let's just try it. Who would it make sense? And then when it started to make sense, then I knew I had to do it. It took a lot of rewriting to get it to work, because otherwise it was just like this generic voice. So I had to make it this specific person. But yeah, it was not until very, very late drafts, but the seeds of the storyteller were always there.
How did world building come to you? Like, there's a map of Shenandoah in the beginning, and it's very beautiful. How did that process happen? Did the worlds build around the characters, or did the characters feel like they naturally entered the world? For you as a writer, I could,
Yes.
when you read the book, you could be like, oh yeah, this is what happened. It's as you were saying, it's a portal fantasy. Or isekai, as the kids like to call it these days. That's Japanese anime and manga where people go into another world.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, it is. But it is a portal fantasy, so that the characters are the ones who are entering it. But for you as a writer, how did that work?
Well, the original was much darker. It was more. The original drafts were more science fiction, and it was more like a wormhole to an alien world, and it was a very violent alien world. And Rafe and Jeremy had this relationship with a princess who they both loved and protected, and kind of went to war over, and that was leftover Lord of the Flies. And I had to just leave that behind. I had to go, I'm getting influenced in the wrong way. This is really Narnia. This is less Lord of the Flies, more Narnia. That's what I wanted it to be. And so I had to just throw out an entire draft and start over, start fresh, and think about Narnia, but an American Narnia, West Virginia Narnia. So C.S. Lewis was born and raised in West Virginia. All of the places in Shenandoah are named after real places in West Virginia. Every place on the map is a place you'll find on a West Virginia map. And what's funny is, when I was figuring out where Rafe lived in West Virginia, I have a West Virginia gazetteer, and you just kind of put stuff in a book. Oh, it took him 45 minutes to reach Morgantown, something like that. And you look at the map, and I figured out the city where he lived, or near where he lived and whatnot. And I zoomed in, and it was right near Shaffer Mountain, spelled exactly the same way we spell Shaffer. And I was like, oh, destiny. right there on the map. Rafe lives on Shaffer Mountain in West Virginia. So Shenandoah became a West Virginia Narnia. The landscape is very similar to West Virginia. It's a more feminine Narnia because for one thing, I'm writing it, and it has a queen, and so I wanted to make it a little more girl friendly, with more strong female characters in it. But yeah, it all came from a combination of my love of portal Portal Worlds, Narnia, and West Virginia, which I live in Kentucky, which is right next to West Virginia. If you've never been there, I recommend it. It is a magical, spooky state. It is literally 75% trees. It is wooded mountains wherever you go. You will drive on the highways or these like 2-lane roads and look down, and it will look like ocean waves, but they're all trees. And it's endless. And if you go in October, it's magical. It's the most beautiful place in the world in October. Forget New England, go to West Virginia. But West Virginia is also a state suffering from population loss. So it is a state that understands loss. It is a state with a lot of ghost towns. So it really, the heart of the story of the magic comes directly from everything I know and love and care about West Virginia.
Well, you've sold me. Are you working on another Meg Shaffer book then? This
I
just
am,
wild.
yes.
Did actually, I'll have to ask though, real quick. Did the Wishing Game? Did you start this first or the Wishing Game first?
I started the Wishing Game in 2017, back when I was writing romance novels for Harlequin. I had this idea of a Willy Wonka for grown-ups book, and I pitched it to Harlequin, and they said, "This is not a romance novel, no thank you." But I thought, this is a good idea though. Maybe it's not a Tiffany Rice book, but eventually I will write it. And then the pandemic came along and I had a lot of free time, so I wrote it. And then I started The Lost Story in 2018 when it was really just my husband was going to the Key West Literary Seminar. They have writing workshops. He had gotten into a workshop, and I looked and I saw Richard Russo, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Empire Falls, and the author of one of my favorite books, Bridge of Sighs, was teaching an advanced fiction workshop. And you had to submit 20 pages to get into it. And so I wrote the first 20 pages of The Lost Story and submitted it, hoping to get into Richard Russo's fiction workshop. And I did. And now I have a Richard Russo blurb on the cover of The Lost Story. All because, so the book exists because of Richard Russo, which people would go, wait a minute, he doesn't write fantasy. How does this happen? But yes, the entire book exists because I wanted to get into his class.
So yeah, circling back then, is there another Meg Shaffer book?
Oh yes. So the answer is yes. Yeah. Because I got sidetracked because you asked which came first.
Oh, I got sidetracked first.
Yeah.
I sidetracked.
Yes. So I am working on a book now, and I was just before my hair is all frizzy because I was out in the humidity because I walked back from a coffee shop in the humidity because I was working on the new book at our local coffee shop. So this one's got a touch of Nancy Drew and a touch of Alice in Wonderland. We'll see if any of that ends up in the final draft, but for now that's where I'm going. So I hope to get that finished writing this year, and hopefully we'll be out at some point.
Do you have a name, or you can't say?
Well, the title will probably change, so I don't give out the title because I don't want people imprinting on it and then going to look for it. It's not there. So,
fair enough. Yeah. All right.
So Meg Shaffer book 3.
Awesome. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
So check out The Lost Story. Check out The Wishing Game. They
Please
are
do.
they are both really refreshing and just nice reads. In fact, one of our librarians was just recommending The Wishing Game the other day, and I was like,
Good.
I'm interviewing her.
Awesome.
Yes.
They're books for people who love books.
And
I assume that's everyone who is listening to this podcast.
Yes, of course. So once again, this was Jessica. Our guest today was
Meg Shaffer.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.